I'd like to begin by asking you to fly with me in your mind to northern Uganda in East Africa, a place that has been convulsed by a war for over 20 years, beginning in the late 1980s. A war between a kind of cultish guerrilla group, religiously informed, called the Lord's Resistance Army, and on the other side, the Ugandan government. A war with a very high death toll. Lord's Resistance Army recruits its members, its army, by abductions, and so some 20,000 child soldiers were abducted and forced to carry on the killing of the army, and at one point the war had caused 2 million people to be forced to live in camps for internally displaced people. Well, the question has arose, of course, how can peace be achieved? And proposals started to appear for peace, approaches to peace by the mid-1990s. And it evolved into the sight of two very different approaches to peace building, and two very different approaches that ended up kind of modeling a conversation that, in fact, has been replicated around the globe. So we can see this as kind of an exemplary case in that sense. On one hand, is an approach exemplified by the International Criminal Court. Many of you may know of the courts. It's really a kind of attempt to revive the precedent of the Nuremberg trials, where there could be an international tribunal for individual war criminals and human rights violators who had committed terrible crimes. Uganda was the site of the first indictments. That's why it's kind of a banner case for me. The site of the first indictments of the International Criminal Court, which indicted 5 Ugandan perpetrators of war crimes in the Lord's Resistance Army. Some of you may also know of Uganda through the famous video, the Kony 2012 video. This was a video produced by an NGO called Invisible Children and released this past March. The video instantly went viral and ended up getting 100 million hits, became an internet phenomenon. And what it was trying to do was, in a sense, lobby the U.S. government for military action in Africa that could help to arrest Joseph Kony, the leader of the Lord's Resistance Army, which I think is a good thing to do. The real star of that video was Luis Moreno Ocampo, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. And so in a way, this video, Kony 2012, was designed to stir up activism, which it did. But if you look at the approach to peace building that was embedded in it, it is very much this kind of international community, ICC style approach. Well, a very different approach to peace building came from an unlikely source, religious leaders. Namely, a group of religious leaders called the Acholi Religious Leaders Peace Initiative. Now, this was a remarkable group of religious leaders who were, including the Catholic cardinal, the Anglican bishops, and as well as the local Muslim leader, who ended up devising a whole approach to peace building that was very different. They themselves courageously went out into the bush to meet Joseph Kony, and they ended up becoming major advocates of the Amnesty Act of 2000, which was a law that sought to demobilize and reintegrate child soldiers through an amnesty law. In other words, we're not going to punish you if you give up your arms and come home. They very much placed the problem of reintegration at the center of their efforts, but in many ways they drew from their religious logics, their theologies, their traditions. Forgiveness was a major component of their message. Not forgiveness in isolation, but forgiveness rooted in other practices like reparations and accountability and truth-telling. But nevertheless, forgiveness, promoted as a major tool for reintegrating people back in villages together where they could live together who had been estranged by terrible acts of violence. Well, what Uganda has generated is two answers to a question that has been asked all over the globe in the past generation, and indeed the question in my book: what is the meaning of justice when massive injustices have taken place? The book finds its setting in what amounts to one of the most interesting global trends of the past generation, a proliferation of activities and institutions to address injustices of the past in the interest of peace building. Think of the criminal court, and as well as a host of tribunals for trying war criminals all over the world. We've seen 40 truth commissions, reparation schemes, apologies are breaking out all over the place in a political context. Forgiveness is being talked about in global politics in a way that it wasn't, say, 40, 50 years ago. Building of monuments and memorials, and even efforts to build reconciliation at the level of civil society. That's been my entree into this subject. I was involved in Kashmir, working for an NGO, making trips over a period of 6 to 7 years, and more recently have been involved in Central Africa under the auspices of the Catholic Peacebuilding Network. Well, it is in just this setting that the question is asked, what is the meaning of justice in the wake of massive injustice? The dominant answer to this question is what may be called the liberal peace. It's dominant because it prevails in the leading global institutions, the UN, Western governments, and so forth. By liberal, I mean based on the ideas of the Enlightenment, like individual rights, human rights, and the rule of law, and with a very central role for judicial prosecution. And the ICC can sort of be thought of as the signature idea of the liberal peace. But an alternative challenger paradigm has also arisen. It has shaped the approach to this question in South Africa, Timor-Leste, Guatemala, Chile, Sierra Leone, Uganda, and many other places. And it goes by the name reconciliation. If rights is the central idea of the liberal peace, the central idea here is restoration of relationship. It is a holistic restoration. It includes human rights, I believe, does not reject them, but it's much wider, aiming at addressing the wide range of wounds that war and dictatorship inflict on people. It addresses these wounds both because it is intrinsically just to do so, and because doing so helps to build up qualities like trust and legitimacy for democratic governments and peace settlements. Unless people's emotions of hatred and revenge are addressed, peace and democracy are not likely to be sustainable. Now, this way of thinking about justice, I argue, comes to us from religious traditions. And in the book, I highlight Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, although I think it could be extended to other religions in interesting ways. In the scriptures of these faiths, restoration of right relationship characterizes the action of God, but is also prescribed for horizontal relations within human communities. Reconciliation is not some utopian end state where everyone is hugging each other. I rather have in mind political reconciliation, where people respect one another's rights as citizens. But even political reconciliation requires far more than rights, law, and prosecuting war criminals. The book outlines 6 practices that address the range of wounds that political injustices inflict, and each in their own way seek to bring about the restoration of persons and relationships. Briefly, they are the building of socially just institutions, acknowledgement, reparations, what I call restorative punishment, apology, and forgiveness. Each of these practices has taken place all over the world in scores of countries around the world over the past generation. It's also worth saying that they are always partially achieved, far from perfect, hobbled by power, complexity, and the sheer magnitude of suffering. But even if partially achieved, they do take place, and stories and accounts from around the world reveal that they also yield successes.